When I read the story of Moses in the Bible, I sometimes can't help but to think of a TV show that you have probably heard of. You may have even watched, though I won't blame you if you don't admit that part this morning. But For the Good of Humanity has been off the air for a few years now. America's Most Wanted. Remember that show? It was on Fox forever, and then it skipped around networks for 3 or 4 years until they finally had to admit it was really dead. Seriously. In every episode of America's Most Wanted, John Walsh, the host, he would describe real-life deeds of drug dealers and kidnappers and murderers and con men. And then they'd do the dramatic thing where they kind of act them out. And then he'd tell us how these people had escaped justice and were currently on the run and might even be hiding in our own neighborhood tonight. Now, of course, if this was at the time of Moses, of course, wouldn't have been America's Most Wanted, would it? Would have been Egypt's Most Wanted. But chances are pretty good they would have done an episode about Moses. I mean, think about it, seriously. Exodus tells us that Moses started life as the illegal and endangered son of Hebrew slaves, but through some creative basket weaving by his mom, got a place in the upper crust of Egyptian society. In fact, he became an adopted son of one of Pharaoh's daughters, the king's daughter. But then, as every story has to go, there's a twist, right? Things go bad. If you look at verse 12 of Exodus 2, go ahead and turn there now. This is page 46 if you're going to use the blue Bibles in front of you. In verse 12 of Exodus 2, it says Moses killed a man. It says he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. I mean, he's got a reason. This man was mistreating Hebrew slaves. But I'm sure the Egyptians wouldn't have necessarily seen that as a valid reason, would they? And while Exodus says that Moses didn't see anybody while he did it, that looking this way and that, it turns out, we look at Exodus, that at least one person saw Moses, right? It says in verse 15 of chapter 2, Pharaoh heard of Moses' murder, and he sought to kill Moses. Now, of course, I hope we are rooting for Moses in this because we know the whole story of the Exodus, or at least because we've seen Disney's Prince of Egypt. But at this point, at this moment, if we just stop here, it does look like Moses belongs in an episode of Egypt's Most Wanted, doesn't it? I mean, he's killed a man, and he's on the run for it. In fact, Exodus tells us he's moved to another country as part of getting away. Verse 15, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. And Exodus tells us that Moses didn't just run away. He also did his best to leave his past behind, just like someone would do on an episode of America's Most Wanted. He no longer acts like he's the Prince of Egypt. Instead, he goes to ground. He marries into a local family and starts a new career. Of course, it is right here that things kind of get off the America's Most Wanted script, because the Egyptians don't seem to be very interested in hunting him down, do they? In fact, it almost seems like they forget he exists. That, friends, doesn't mean that Moses doesn't get found, does it? What we read about this morning in Exodus chapter 3 is about how God finds Moses. You see, Moses is out in that new job, shepherding his father-in-law's sheep. I have to say, that is humble work for a former member of a royal family, isn't it? But in the midst of this humble new day job, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And Moses looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. Now just think about that for a moment. Has anyone here ever started a fire in the desert? Not surprised you haven't, and probably good that you haven't, because there's one thing about the desert is anything you find that burns up just like that. doesn't it? But that isn't happening here. This is a very strange thing that Moses is seeing. So he can't help himself. Exodus says he has to go check this out. I'll turn aside and see this great sight, he says. So Moses approaches this burning but not burnt up bush. And it's there, in that moment, that he's caught, isn't it? He's trapped. He's found. Moses, who no doubt wanted nothing more than to simply disappear and be forgotten by the Egyptians, to no longer even think probably of his own identity as one of God's chosen people, is in the presence of his people's God. God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. We have to admit, even though Moses is on the run, even though he is no doubt surprised and taken aback and shocked by what has just happened to him, he gives what I think is probably the best possible answer for when you unexpectedly find yourself in the presence of God. He says just 3 words in verse 4 of Exodus 3, doesn't he? Here I am. Here I am. If there was ever a time to follow the KISS, that is the keep it simple, stupid, rule in communications, I think this moment is it, isn't it? Moses nails this. Here I am. It's an answer that gives all the initiative to God. Here I am. Say what you are going to say to me, God. God, do what you're going to do. Here I am. So God, Exodus tells us, takes Moses up on this. And he gives Moses 2 commandments, both in verse 5 here in Exodus chapter 3. First, do not come near. You're close enough. And take your sandals off your feet. In other words, God continues, Moses, you are on holy ground. You are in the presence of a holy God. This is not your place anymore. This is God's place. And he goes on, this is not just any God you are talking to. It's your God. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Friends, I'm wondering, have you ever found yourself unexpectedly speaking to or hearing from your God? Have you ever discovered to your great surprise that you are standing on holy ground? My guess is our mileage varies on this, right? Some of us may have had experiences that feel at least a little bit like this. Powerful, overwhelming, awe-inspiring, unexpected moments with God. Others of us may even struggle to imagine what that would be like in this world we live in. Now, if you haven't experienced those moments, there are a couple things I'd like you to take away from Moses in Exodus chapter 3 this morning. And the first, friends, is just simply that you might. God still does this sort of thing. You do not need to be looking for him, if you will pardon the pun, under every bush. He may already be looking for you. And if he is looking for you, he will catch you, just like he caught Moses. Friends, I would not be here this morning except that God spoke to me at a specific time in a specific place about what he planned to do with my life. God may talk to you in just that way as well. Be aware. Watch out. The second thing that we can take away from this, and this is really for all of us, whether or not we have heard God's voice, is that where God is by definition holy. I think in the past it has been tempting to connect holiness to things, right? To church buildings maybe, to relics, to altars. We have to acknowledge that is not quite right, is it? Because it is not things that are by nature holy. It's God. But God is present among things. And his presence makes the place he is, the physical place he is, holy. That is set apart for him. The burning bush here in Exodus chapter 3 reminds us of that. And when he is present, when he is speaking, we do well to recognize it and act accordingly in that place with reverence and fear and forethought. Friends, holy ground is not just a metaphor. It's a real thing that can exist in the real world. That reality, that God can and is locally present with his people today, is why here at Epiphany, for instance, we practice such care and reverence when we celebrate the Eucharist together. God says he is present with us in that moment, and we believe him, and we act accordingly with those things and in this place. How could we do otherwise when we serve a holy God? Now, briefly, at least, to get back to this text, because the story goes on, doesn't it? We just get a little snippet of it this morning. Moses does recognize the reality of God's presence and holiness. He acts with reverence and fear. Exodus chapter 3, verse 6 says he covers his face because he's afraid to look at God. And we could go on and talk about how God sends Moses back to Egypt, back to the nation and people he has fled for his life. We could talk about how Moses doesn't want to do that. In fact, here in chapter 3 or 4 of Exodus, you can count not once, not twice, but 5 times that Moses says to this holy God that he's scared to death of, I think you've got the wrong guy. Find someone else. And that's interesting, and it does connect with us, because that is the story of God's people. But instead of focusing in that direction for the rest of our time this morning, I want us to take what happened to Moses at Mount Horeb when he saw that burning bush and unexpectedly met God. I want us to take what happened there and apply it to ourselves, both as individuals and as a church community here at Epiphany. Because, friends, it is not enough this morning to recognize that God could call us. And it's not enough to recognize that we would be standing on holy ground if he were to do so. We must recognize that he does and he has called us, whether we have heard him verbally or not, just as he called Moses. Friends, Moses' call is in reality very similar to the call we each receive and respond to when we choose to be or choose to continue to be a Christian. The power of sin in our lives means that in a very real way, we are all criminals on the run from a king, just like Moses was. And just like Moses, we cannot fix the mess we are in. It is tempting to go to ground, so to speak, and to focus on small things instead of big questions about life. But God comes to us. He reveals himself to us, not as a flame on a bush in the desert, but through his Son, Jesus Christ. Really interesting school of interpretation I haven't got into here, but this is a connection that Christians have noticed for thousands of years. Let's say 2,000. Not much more than that we can give, I suppose. But notice how this burning bush plays the same role for Moses as Christ plays for us, so much so that they have connected this angel in the burning bush with Jesus Christ. I don't know if there's anything to that connection or not, but the idea is there. It's something Christians have noticed for many years, and how this call is similar to the call we have. So we can't fix the mess we're in, but God comes to us. He reveals himself to us through his Son, Jesus Christ. And he calls us by name. And what more can we say to him than what Moses said? Here I am. Friends, our story, each of our stories as Christians, as followers of Jesus, is in fact the same story as Moses' story. We have been called. We have been caught. We have been found by God. But that all begs a question. doesn't it? If, like Moses, we have been caught and called by God, what's our mission? You see, God didn't respond to Moses' "here I am" by saying, "well, here I am too." He had a job, a mission for Moses to accomplish. And I have to say right up front, I think individual missions vary. What I was called to is different than what you may be called to. And churches' missions vary. There's a general mission that all churches share together, the Great Commission. It's a really good picture of that. Acts 2:42 is a picture of that. But we also have specific callings and missions. But while that is the case, I do think there is a common thread that runs through Moses' encounter that we read about this morning with God at the burning bush, all the way to today, to each of us in the Church of the Epiphany. The mission we are called to when God calls us to follow him is always in some way not just to go out from a bad place or to go on with our life as it was before we met God, but to go back. Our mission is to go back. What do I mean by that? Well, Moses' encounter with the God of his fathers wasn't really just for Moses, was it? It was for his whole people, slaves to the Egyptians. God did not leave Moses to go on where he was in Midian. He didn't send him out from Egypt to safety. He sent him back to the place he had fled. Verse 10, chapter 3, "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh." So Christians here at Epiphany this morning, by definition, you have been called just like Moses was called. We are each on God's most wanted list. And in the end, he found us, revealed himself to us, and announced himself to us as our God. What has he called us back to? Your situation, your calling may be different than mine. You may be called, for instance, to be a Christian at your place of work. How many people there even know you follow Jesus? You may be called to be a Christian, God's representative in your family system. Are you? You may be called to be a Christian to your neighbors, to offer gentleness, love, help, and friendship in Christ's name to those right next door to you, no matter how different they may be from you. Do you? And I know that just like Moses, it is not a necessarily comfortable thing to be sent back to those places as a Christian, back to those relationships, particularly as a Christian. It can feel like having a target on your back. But nonetheless, that is an important part of how God calls and what he does. We are best to acknowledge it. Go back. The mission always includes going back. So this call applies to each of us as Christians, each of us as individuals. We need to pray and discern exactly how, but we should expect that part of our calling as Christians is to go back into the world we're from. I also think this is worth wrestling with as a church. You see, churches, I believe, are called to go back as well. At the same time, I think we have to acknowledge it can be tempting, even very tempting here at Epiphany sometimes, to stay put, can't it? Now, to be absolutely clear, this sermon is in no way a call to go back to our old building or our old life. This is not about location. It's about orientation. Do we face, here at Epiphany, do we face out into northern Virginia with all its challenges and difficulties and opportunities for the good news of Jesus Christ? Or do we face in toward ourselves? Where are we at with that at Epiphany? I mean, just a very practical way I think about this, and I don't have an answer. I haven't done the math. I'd probably get it wrong if I did, those of you who know how I do math. But if we were to count up all the volunteer hours we spend in this church? How many of them go solely for us to support the things that need to happen in here versus how many are aimed out to the world around us? I'm not saying in any way it's bad to do things here to help us. That is always going to be part of our life. And that's part of how we care for each other, how we're the body of Christ. But we need to be pointed both ways, friends. And it would just, I think it's worth us thinking about. What would it look like, for instance, for us to spend at least as much energy, at least as many of those volunteer hours aimed out of this building as we do aimed inside our walls? How could the specific ministry or small group that you are involved in here at Epiphany? One thing I love about Epiphany is almost all of you are involved in a ministry or small group. But how could that ministry or small group that you are involved in here at Epiphany purposely go out and go back as part of your life, as part of what you do together? Now, I do not have a quick and easy answer for this. I have not developed a wonderful program that will make all of this happen. But I do call on us as a church and as leaders of ministries in this church to wrestle with this. Actually, while we are on the topic, I do want to just say there's an easy way you can practice it even in the next week. If you were here for the announcements, you heard about how we support the field day over at Coates Elementary School. That's next Monday. There's a session about 2 hours in the morning, about 2 hours in the afternoon. That is a way to go out and go back into our neighborhood in the next week. If you're interested in that, just tell Father Michael, who'll get you on the list. That's a way we can go back right now. But friends, where and how is God calling us as Church of the Epiphany to do this, to go back to the world we have been taken out of? I know at the end of the day, as we think about these things, it may not feel like we are great candidates for this mission, much less great candidates for America's Most Wanted or Egypt's Most Wanted. But we are. We are every bit as good a candidate as Moses was. But the truth is that it is not Jack Walsh, but God who wants us, who calls us as Christians, who catches us, who places us on holy ground, who identifies himself as the God of our fathers and of our mothers. And most importantly, as he does that, it is God who calls us back, both as individuals and as a church, to a world that, for many good reasons, is easy to flee, that desperately needs us. Will we hear this call? Will we wrestle not just with what God has called us out of? It is important to wrestle with that. There are things we definitely need to be called out of as Christians, but also with what God has called us back to. My prayer is that we will here at Epiphany. Amen.